Okay, it's 10 after I'm starting, and I have a couple of announcement type things to say first, so shh. The first is, a couple of people have asked whether the final exam is comprehensive. The answer is yes, definitively. Your job is not to forget everything you learned in the first part of the course. Your job is to remember everything. And there will be lots of links between the later parts of the course and the earlier parts of the course. Everything from understanding institutions better when we get to talking about political institutions more directly to lots more in class. The second thing is registering to vote. So it's really, really important to vote. And how many of you are not from California? Okay, so most of you are from California. And how many of you are under 18? Very few. Okay, so most of you are California voters. And if you are not registered, you absolutely should register to vote. California is actually a very interesting example of the effects of having certain kinds of political institutions. So you will understand those lectures better if you have actually struggled to vote. So I'm not requiring voting as part of your, there won't be a question on the exam based on the sample ballot. Although boy, oh boy, is that interesting. I already have mine. Then I'll just also make the modest point. It says here something about rally and day of action in defense of public education. You can rally, and indeed you could burn down whole blocks of cities and so forth. Wouldn't do a thing. Whereas if you vote and your family votes and everyone votes, if everyone in the state voted, we would have a radically more egalitarian policy. If everyone in the country voted, we would have a radically more equal society. So this, believe it or not, it sounds trite, but it is the only way to have access to power. And I will just make the very important point that if you elect, if you choose not to choose, you are asking other people to choose for you. It's as simple as that. There's no such thing as not choosing. There's only choosing to make your choice and choosing to have someone else choose for you. That's what happens. So I'm going to send out a link on BSpace to register to vote, and you should do it. Okay, so the final exam is comprehensive, and you should register to vote. The third thing is that we are now entering 2 more weeks of reading theory. So this is like the weeks when we read Durkheim. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about today, Davis and Moore, is quite straightforward, and in places it's positively dumb or silly or something. Not hard to read, not hard to understand, maybe a little hard to understand why I assigned it, but in and of itself it's not difficult. The next reading is Max Weber, and that is W-E-B-E-R, spelled like Weber, but all good sociologists pronounce it as if they knew how to pronounce it in German, and it's something on the order of Weber. So don't be confused. Every time you hear Weber, that's Weber with a W, W-E-B-E-R. And so next lecture is about Max Weber, and that is a classic piece of sociological theory. It's not long. It is very, very dense. I'll explain a little bit about why it's badly written is not quite the right word, but a lot of what Weber, his most influential book, was not finished when he died. So parts of it are like a compressed outline, parts of it are very eloquently, carefully written, parts of it are, that's true for Marx, by the way, as well. Capital was never finished. Okay, and then the next week we are reading excerpts from Karl Marx, and that is really difficult and really fascinating and really, really important. So I'm counting on you. The way this works, really the only way it works, is you read this stuff and you don't really understand it. You go to section and you discuss it and you still don't understand it. I lecture on it in class, and you still don't understand it. And then you go back and read it again, and you begin to understand it. And if you don't go through all those steps, if you think you can skip reading it the first time, when you actually read it, you will be so confused, you won't know whether you're coming or going. So I beg you, do not fall behind. This is not, these 2 weeks, so you had no reading last week, you studied for the exam, you coasted from Wednesday at 11 a.m., maybe you caught up in your other classes and had many other midterms, I don't know. But from my point of view, you had absolutely nothing on your minds. So now I am really, really asking you to read and read carefully and persist. These are, I'll bracket Davis and Moore here, but Max Weber and Karl Marx are great minds whose work still is among the most influential in the world in the social sciences, all across the social sciences, and to some degree in the real world. So please read these things. They are vital. Okay. Now, Davis and Moore, A Theory of Stratification. I'm going to talk not only about their actual argument, but about what it means to read about and think about a theory. So I'm going to try to draw some general lessons about what it means to think through a theory. And the first question you should ask of any theory, and usually of any book you read on anything, is what is the question they are asking? And often you will find that theorists disagree or seem to disagree because they are asking fundamentally different questions. So the question Davis and Moore are asking is a really weird question. They are asking, why is there social inequality? Why does it exist? So you might be in the field of biology and study all sorts of differences between one organism and another and how the genes work in, different kinds of animals, or you might study different parts of the genetic code, or you might study how the different biochemistries of different parts of the process of gene expression work. But has anybody ever asked you to answer the question outside church? Why does life exist? I mean, it's not that there are no answers to that question. Evolutionary biologists kind of have maybe how did it come to exist? That they could they answer that question. But why does life exist? Again, outside of a religious answer, I won't say there aren't any scientific answers, but it's just not the kind of question that scientists spend a lot of time on. So one of the first things to notice about Davis and Moore is that it's a somewhat peculiar question. Why does inequality exist? And they ask, why does it exist? What are its functions? What's good about it? How does inequality contribute to the functioning of society? That is the classic example of a functionalist argument. But at first, they are asking, why does inequality exist? And you might say, even just in the back of your mind, versus what? Like, you mean, why does inequality exist versus total equality? And then you try to imagine, well, what would it take to produce total equality? That would actually be strange. So why does inequality exist at one level? You'd say, what else would you expect? I mean, it's just hard to even. Now, of course, they're not just asking why inequality exists at all. They're particularly asking why the social positions in societies come with very unequal rewards attached to them. So they're not asking why people are unequal. They're asking why social positions are unequal. And their argument is that social positions in societies. And again, remember, they're generalizing across all societies. They don't provide much evidence, but they are everything from, you know, ancient kingdoms to modern industrial societies and everything in between. And I mean, and the argument is that positions are rewarded unequally, that inequality in rewards to positions, meaning the jobs you could have in society, that's what they're really talking about, exist for the good of society, to reward skills that are valuable for society and that are scarce. So it's a pretty straightforward supply and demand argument, right? So positions are highly rewarded when, again, there's lots of demand, these things are very needed by society, and there is a relatively small supply of skills. And if you've discussed this in section, or when you discuss it in section, you'll notice that they even have answers for things like why hereditary kings should get huge amounts of wealth. And they argue, well, you know, if your hereditary king does a really bad job, like says, I'm already the king. All I have to do is lie around in my boudoir with lots of food and wine and have sex all the time and, you know, have people massage my feet. And I don't know what you would do if you were a king, but, you know, musicians come and play their lyres and things like that. It could be nice. And you have no compulsion to do your job. You just don't even think it's needed. Then the whole society falls apart because you're the only one who can make the decisions. You're the one who has to lead the troops into battle. So they've got an argument about how this is generally true, that positions are rewarded unequally when skills are incredibly valuable for society and scarce. But while they talk about kings, I think what they're really thinking of is doctors. So doctors do something incredibly important. They cure illnesses or diagnose things or repair things. And you want not any, you know, not very bright, not very committed person doing it. You want the best, the most committed, the most skilled. And so at some level, society needs those positions filled with the best and the brightest. It needs the position of financier filled with the best and the brightest, and so it creates enormously unequal rewards in order to get really good people who are really smart and really committed doing these things that are really important for society. That's their answer. Now, another thing you always want to do with a theory is consider its hidden assumptions. What is kind of built in that you don't notice at first? What are they taking for granted? And Davis and Moore are, of course, taking for granted a whole bunch of things that are kind of, and you are assigned a critical essay, kind of the answer to Davis and Moore, and their answer, and the answer to the answer, and so forth. And the critics, Melvin Tooman makes this point. So the first thing is this definition of what's valuable. And if your image is the physician, then you say, well, yes, very valuable for society. If your image is the highly paid jeweler at Cartier, or I don't know where rich people really get their jewels, but you know, the most incredibly skilled jeweler who makes the most beautifully twinkling tiaras that anyone who's incredibly wealthy is dying to have, or the skilled manufacturers of the most beautifully crafted yachts, or the skilled, what do I want to call them, customizers of the most high-end Lamborghinis and the designers of those things. Well, those people have skills that are really, really valuable, not for society, but for the people who have the money to buy those things. And if the people who have the money to buy those things want not just any old car, but a car that has been specially modified by the most skilled designer and mechanic on the planet, they'll pay for it because it's very, very valuable to them. Or if, you know, movie, yeah, I'm sorry it's so warm. I have no idea what the story is here. You know, if some movie starlet or somebody who inherited billions of dollars from her or his financier parent wants one of these exquisite things, well, you know, it's very, very valuable to them. So what makes skills valuable, at least in a market economy like ours, what makes them valuable is that people with money can afford to pay for them, right? Not that they're necessarily valuable for the health or well-being of society. The second question that the critics raise, I think, is really important, which is, are skills maximized? And this is the critics' major argument, that if you really wanted the most skilled people doing things, you would make sure you had an incredibly open, to use Acemoglu and Robinson's term, inclusive, competitive society in which the most talented people got the opportunities. But of course, that is, in many, many societies, not the case. In fact, you know, I don't know, half the societies in human history were basically slave societies of one sort or another, not like American chattel slavery, but the kind where one people conquers another people, and the conquered people are slaves to the unconquered people, to the people who conquered them. And there's no competition. The people who are slaves and children of slaves can't compete for any of the good jobs. They're slaves. That's their life. Or, we'll talk more about this, but in medieval society and feudalism, people were born serfs, that's peasants, and they legally had to stay serfs their whole lives. They weren't allowed to carry swords or wear armor like the knights. So the most important thing for society was to be good warriors. That was how feudalism worked. It was being able to fight off other people's armies was the most important social skill. And people who were great warriors became heroes, became kings, became very powerful, but most people weren't allowed to compete. It was actually, again, illegal for someone who wasn't born a noble to carry a sword. So you couldn't even practice. It's like if you had foot races that determined who was the leader of the society, and half the people in the society simply were required to only walk and never run. Well, so just as a matter of description, the idea that there really is, if societies were trying to maximize the skills of the people doing the most important jobs, then societies ought to put a very, very high premium on the most open possible competition for positions, right? And the third question, which is in a sense the reciprocal of the other one, is what makes skills scarce? That is, we said, oh, being a doctor is, you know, very, very difficult, and so the people who are bright enough and committed enough, and if surgeons have to have quick hands or whatever, so you could argue that the skill of being a brilliant, yeah, it's hot, of being a brilliant diagnostician or a brilliant surgeon or something is naturally scarce. But in fact, and this is one of the critical points we're going to look at next when we get to Weber, social groups organize to keep skills scarce. You can't just go out and set up a hair salon. Even if you are really, really, really skilled at cutting your, let's say you cut your sister's and your cousin's and your grandma's hair, and you've just got a knack for it, and you just do a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful job. You cannot go out and start a hair cutting business unless you are licensed. And being licensed means you have to go to beauty school. And then you have to pass various state licensing exams. And many of the organizations that run such licensing exams, this will be particularly important for any of you who are imagining becoming therapists, psychotherapists of various sorts, do counseling and stuff, are designed to make sure that there isn't too much competition. So they are designed to make many, many, many people fail. So you have to have, well, those of you who are planning to become attorneys, lawyers, there are bar exams. And the bar exam is set up to have many, many people fail it because they try to keep a lid on the number of lawyers, right? So there are many, many ways in which the scarcity of skills is determined by organizations that make sure they will be scarce. As a professor, if there's somebody in this class who could teach, or one of the teaching GSIs, or some nice PhD out there on the street who doesn't have a job currently, or even someone, heaven forfend, without a PhD, who actually knows a lot more sociology than I do and is a better teacher, the whole university system is set up to make sure that person cannot compete for my job. There's no annual, I mean, I don't want to be too cynical here. That is, they presumably go to a lot of trouble to hire the best and the brightest, and there are very good reasons for tenure, and you do get reviewed, and teaching matters, and all of that is true. But nonetheless, restricting competition in such a way that it's not really mainly about who has the best skills for the job. The skills are scarce partly because, maybe even largely because, of restrictive, both invisible and visible restrictions that keep those skills scarce. So Davis and Moore they assume a whole set of things that actually there's not much evidence for. Indeed, a major assumption of the theory is a kind of open, competitive market world, right? So hidden behind this theory is the image that everyone is competing, and everyone is competing as an individual. And think about that. What does it mean to imagine a world in which everyone is competing as an individual? It's actually it's a very nice thought. And it actually fits some of the world we know. That is, you here in college, in a very weird little way, you live in an artificial world that we do a great deal to make artificial. So my tremendous effort to tell you not to plagiarize, the enormous effort we make to not test you on things you knew before you got to class, but to test you only on what actually occurred here in the classroom and in your readings and in your sections. And it might be very, very reasonable, to let you use, when you're out there in the real world of work, if you know people who can help you get your job done better, you're supposed to develop a new computer program to solve some very important problem at work, and you call your brilliant college friend who's 4 times better computer whiz than you are and always has a solution to anything, and your friend says, no, don't write that code, write this code, just do it, it's easy, I'll send you, oh, never mind, I'll send you 4 lines of code, solve all your problems. You grab it. You look at those people in there was a nice story, not about Silicon Valley, but about the south of market.com businesses. And they hang around in coffee houses and various other gathering places looking for super smart people whose super smart ideas they can take advantage of. And that's not, you know, it's not considered bad that it's not you, but it's your pod of friends who like you and have shared ideas with you, who really get ahead. It's not you as an individual. But in college, we create this wonderful, magical little world in which you're supposed to compete as an individual, and we create a whole kind of illusory system in which you do compete as an individual. Now, in this particular course at least, we don't have a curve, so we don't emphasize competing, but we do emphasize individual effort and reward for individual merit. So our idea is the more you learn here, the more you really throw yourself into learning, the better you'll do. And it's you as an individual who are doing that. So there are lots of places in a society like ours where the arguments Davis and Moore make, we run our institutions so as to make those arguments seem true. Right? That is, Davis and Moore's argument seems plausible partly because of the kind of institutional order we live in. And we really do live in an institutional order that culturally emphasizes the value of the individual and individual effort. So that's one thing. We just have a huge ideology. If you listen to the presidential debates or the vice presidential debates, you will hear so much about people who work hard and play by the rules, and 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 oh, they work hard and play by the rules. And they're the ones who we want a society with opportunity where people who work hard and play by the rules can get ahead. Right? That's, I mean, the whole idea is that what we want, what we have, what we believe in, what we share as Americans, and there are a few other ideas. You should make choices and be free and various other things. But the idea is that opportunity should be available to people who work hard and play by the rules. And so we culturally create a world in which we basically tell people that society is the way Davis and Moore say it is. And one reason I assign this paper, which if I gave it to you completely naively and gave you 2 hours and told you you'd only pass the course if you figured out 4 serious criticisms of the article, you could probably come up with everything I just told you. Not that hard. But the reason I assign it is because it is so believable in the world we live in. It really makes sense. And a lot of our experience is structured that way. So it's structured, and here I'm really talking about the last point, and then I'm going to go up and talk about, and I realize it actually makes more logical sense to talk about the second point first. Okay, so a lot of the world we live in is in fact structured so that what gets rewarded is human capital, that is the skills you have, and positions are unequally rewarded. And again, you understand what they mean by positions. That is, being a professor comes with a certain salary and certain perks and stuff, independent of who the person is. And then it gets adjusted a little bit depending on you as well. So there's this complex, positions don't just, but if you thought about every job has a salary attached to it, or a salary and a certain sized office and a certain, yeah, like that. So that's what they mean about the rewards to positions. God, it's hot. So this is social experiment, seeing how long we'll torture ourselves before we run out of the room and say we didn't sign up for a sauna, we signed up for a classroom. Ridiculous. Okay, so yes, you have permission to fan yourselves and whatever else is necessary. I am not, however, going to take off my sweater because my arm is gross. Okay. Yeah. So the idea then that there's kind of an open competition for positions, and whether the positions are highly rewarded depends on how many people have the skills and are competing for those positions. And the positions that are more highly rewarded or those that are more valuable is a perfect description almost of how the job market looks from the point of view of someone like you looking for a job. So if you're looking for a job and the skill you have is something everybody has, you're either not going to get a job or your chances of getting it are low, or the job you get is not going to be very well paid because anybody could do it. Whereas if you have some highly specialized skill, that's really an important corporate priority. You're the one who, this is actually true for accounting, for example. Apparently, odd as it seems, not that many people actually manage to master accounting skills, so accounting actually is pretty well, I don't know if it's super well paid, but it's pretty well paid if you can get into an accounting program and you can actually learn what accountants need to learn, because those skills are not all that common. So the work isn't, at least usually, terribly fascinating, but every organization needs such a thing. It's quite important to all their internal controls. And so, but that is true not as a universal feature of all societies. It is true within a market economy like ours, and it is true for a world in which there's a relatively open labor market, which there is. That is, I think corporations really do want to hire the person who's most valuable to them, not who's most valuable to society. And while they might at the same time, corporate executives might want their own not terribly talented children to have wonderful futures, whether they are hardworking, good at math, and generally brilliant or not, and so they do whatever they can to constrict opportunity that might threaten their children's futures. And I'm not picking on corporate executives. Wait till you're a parent. And if you have a network connection that will help your kid, I don't think you are going to stand there and say, oh no, it would be immoral of me to put my kid in touch with this person I happen to know. Most people do these things. But when you're running the corporation, you actually don't hire your own not very bright, not very committed, not very hardworking, not very mathematically sophisticated. And of course, many kids of corporate executives are brilliant. I'm not, but should you be in that situation? So if you take the point of view of the employer, that's kind of, well, they sort of think the way Davis and Moore think they think. And if you take the point of view of the anonymous potential employee looking for a job, well, you know, lo and behold, you kind of have to think the way Davis and Moore want you to think. And in fact, if you don't have a very strong sense of vocation already about some career you know you want because you love it and you're going to pursue it whether it's going to make you a lot of money or not, and you're kind of looking around for where the main chance is, you're presumably using exactly this calculation. What skill could I acquire, given who I am and my existing skill set, that is the most valued and the most rare? So of all your skills, and it may be, you know, joking around with your friends, that's a skill. Don't dismiss it. Once you get that law degree and actually get past the bar, your social skills might actually be more important than your intellectual skills. But whatever, you've got to figure out where you could put your little basket of skills and skills you could potentially learn that will maximize their value And that's a combination of jobs that are highly valued and skills that are in scarce supply. That's a pretty good, but that is within a set of very specific institutions. The institutions of a modern capitalist economy with a certain kind of labor market. And as I pointed out, even within a society like that, a lot of the social processes really don't follow this individual competition model. This is what we'll talk about next time when we talk about Weber, that groups are often competing not to widen opportunity, but to constrict it. Okay, so the last, I don't think this is actually the very last point, but there is another very general point about theory that comes out of Davis and Moore. And this has to do with trying to explain a universal. So at the beginning I said, pay attention to what question they're asking. And one of the weird things, one of the really weird things about Davis and Moore in this example, but also about the whole school of social theory called functionalism, which is now somewhat in disrepute, but was very influential and actually very interesting, is that it often asked questions about universals. So they would ask questions like, why is there inequality in all societies? Why is there an incest taboo in all societies? Everybody know what I mean by an incest taboo? Yeah? I have to make absolutely sure. Anybody just confused about the word or, okay. So incest is sex between close relatives, and all societies, say the anthropologists, forbid sometimes many, many more kinds of sex than we forbid, but incest in our society would be having a sexual relationship between a parent and child, between siblings, between first cousins in some states, not other states. That's basically the American law on incest. In many tribal societies, the incest taboo can extend out to your entire clan. It can mean that you can never speak once you reach adulthood to anyone if you're a male who is defined as an aunt. So your mother's sisters and all their sisters and basically all the adult women. Likewise, for a young girl, you may not be able to speak to or be seen by anybody who are your cousins. In the medieval Europe, there were incest taboos that went out to like 16th cousins. And since all these elite families actually intermarried a lot, going and paying the church to give you an indulgence so that you could marry your 16th cousin twice removed or something was a big deal. Okay, so, but the thing that fascinated these functionalists was that the incest taboo was universal. So why do all societies have incest taboos? Why do all societies have the family? Why? So it takes very different forms in some of the groups I have hung out with, I won't say studied, but hung out with in Malawi. It's basically the mother's brother who runs the family. So what we would think of as the husband, who actually is the progenitor of the child, that is the person who is biologically the source of the baby, is not considered the father. The father is basically the mother's brother, who's the really powerfully influential figure. And you have a society basically formed of sisters and their husbands, and it's one of their brothers who's the patriarch, let's say, of the family. But all societies have families, defined the way sociologists define them, which is some either legal or well understood customary practice in which responsibility for raising children is clearly assigned to adults. So you just don't have situations where children can be raised by anybody. You always have a socially defined form of parenthood. Okay, and then there are a bunch of there's inequality. Why these things exist, say the functionalists. And so they did what Davis and Moore do, which is they sat around thinking about why these things were good for society. So I'll give you, and there's actually a great feminist article, if you ever really, it's one of the early and just brilliant, oh my God, this person was brilliant. Her name is Gayle Rubin, G-A-Y-L-E, Rubin, and the paper is called The Traffic in Women. If you just go on the web, you'll find it in a second. And she has a very good functionalist, it's not really functionalist, but it's politically functionalist, argument about the incest taboo, which is not that it prevents chromosomal defects. I'm sure that's what you all think right away. You think, oh, inbreeding, terrible, terrible, terrible. But in fact, the sociological theory, which is very clever, is that only exogamy, having to marry outside your family, creates social bonds that can create a group larger than the family. That is, if you could marry your own parent or marry your brothers and sisters, your little pod of 10 people, whatever it was, wouldn't need anybody. It would be actually a lot like what Durkheim talked about as mechanical solidarity. You would just be totally attached to each other. After all, who do you love most in the world? Well, the answer is usually your family, right? So if there were no barrier, I know this is kind of disgusting to talk about, but actually when my kids were very little, there's this very beautiful Victorian house across the street from us. It's actually divided up into 4 flats, but it was the original farmhouse in the neighborhood, and it's this sort of gingerbready, it's just a beautiful old house. So our son said, well, when I grow up, I'm going to live there, and I'm going to marry my sister, and we'll just live right there. And I said, sweetie, you know, you can't. And, you know, he said, now I'm sure the thought is, A, he'd rather strangle her than marry her. But second, you know, revolting, and he's married some other very, very nice person. But, you know, at that time, when he was a child, he just thought, well, you know, live right across the street. It was like very, very secure sounding. Okay, so why is the incest taboo universal, the functionalist said? Because that forces families to create bonds with other families. Basically, you can't have society without it. So it's functionally necessary. And then we could go through all these institutions. But the point I want to make is a very general point about social theory, which is that such arguments are great. And you can really enjoy having them, and I encourage you to do so. Why does the family exist? Why does inequality exist? Why does power exist? Why does the state government exist? And you can just make up stories till the cows come home. And they are exactly that. They are what we call just so stories. That is, they make a lot of sense, they're very plausible, and there is no way to test them. That's the problem with attempts to explain a universal. It is almost impossible to test them. So they sound great. They really sound great. And some of them might even be at some level true. But there's no way to know, because something that's always there, you can't design research. You can't, not only you can't imagine an experiment, there are many, many things that are extremely well understood, like, you know, why the Earth rotates or something, that you can't actually do an experiment to stop whatever gravity and the pull of this and that and find out whether you're right. In that way, you can do other sorts of experiments, but not the one that would really, you know, be the definitive, let's create, I don't know, 100 Earths and have them all rotate and then stop the forces of gravity on half of them and see if those stop. I mean, that'd be nice, but you can't do it. But you really can't do scientific work on things that don't vary. So that is a really important lesson. And it comes up in, you'd be surprised how often even very smart people, as were these functionalists, very smart people. In fact, they were so smart that they could make really impressive, plausible arguments about why things had to be there, And those sounded as if they had really explained them, because if the thing has to be there, you kind of have explained it. Except that they aren't the kinds of explanations you could even imagine testing, because there's no variation in the thing you're trying to explain. What you're trying to explain is the universal presence of inequality. And if I say, well, it's due to the fact that the Earth rotates, that's why there's inequality. Or it's due to the fact that there are, you know, I don't know, seasons or day and night, that'd be a good one. Well, that's probably as plausible an explanation as any, because unless you can formulate the question so the thing you want to understand varies. So the kind of question you can ask is, why is the incest taboo extended to many more people in some societies than others? Why is, there's quite good work about why incest occurs, so, which is quite different from why there's an incest taboo, but there is actually quite good work on that, especially coming out of the women's movement, where they uncovered a lot more of this than you would think existed. And likewise, you can ask, why is inequality greater in some societies than others? There's a question you can actually answer. And then you might even answer the question of whether inequality is greater in societies that have greater technical demands for skills. Is inequality of rewards to positions greater? Is inequality of rewards to positions greater where the technical skills required to do work are greater? Now, that's a really great question, and you could ask it about societies throughout human history, and I actually think you would find a very mixed, complicated answer. Lots of contemporary people are also asking the reverse question, which is, among modern industrial societies, are societies with greater inequality in rewards more economically dynamic? And maybe if you really read and thought about Acemoglu and Robinson, you'd have an answer to that. Why is the family different in its structure in some kinds of societies than others? Those are questions you can ask. But in order to really ask a scientifically adequate question, you have to be able to turn a universal or a constant, that's really what you should call it, into a variable. So I'll just make a last point, and this is more than rhetorical, and again, it's amazing how often it comes up. You get students, graduate students, even professors who say things like, I want to study why women are, avoid the sciences, and so I'm going to study what it is about being a woman that makes you avoid the sciences. And what am I going to do? I'm going to interview 100 women or 200 women, and I'm going to vary them by race, class, blah, blah, blah. What's missing? What are you not varying them by? Gender. Yeah, you cannot, if you are just studying women, you cannot find out what it is about being a woman that causes anything. You have to study variation in both the explanatory factor, in this case gender, and in the thing you want to explain. So theory cannot work in the scientific sense. It can work great in the why is there aggression? Oh, because it was biologically inbuilt, because human, sure, fine. That's the sort of E.O. Wilson human nature type stuff. But the challenge is, why does aggression vary? So when people tell you this is why there's war, this is why there's aggression, this is why there's religion, this is why, just think, how would you turn that into an argument about variation, not about a human universal? Because if they're telling you about a human universal, it is a just so story. not a theory. Okay. And I'm sorry it's so hot. I don't know if we can do anything about this.